Hello and welcome to Poly-Innovator. My name is Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator, and this is the Multidisciplinary Spectrum mini-series finale. A lot of words there, but essentially speaking, I've done around 6 episodes in this mini-series, and the whole idea of the Omni content in general is to just be omni-channel. So every episode I make a podcast, a video, and a blog post. Not in that order, but I usually make all 3, and then I try to turn it into some other kind of form of content after that, like slideshows, and tweets, and images, and quotes, anything I can to diversify the content experience in the PolyInnovator ecosystem. That polymathic kind of content really shines when it comes to making something like this, where it's a series, where you really have everything coming together. And I started this series over a year ago, I feel like, and the idea was the polymath spectrum, where like leveling up through the polymathy. But the thing is, polymath is not the only word people like. People like multipotentialite, maybe jack of all trades, that kind of thing. And so this polymath spectrum here, or this multidisciplinary spectrum here, it is around this concept that each of these terms fit into a nice chart that I had made to really exemplify each different term in their own way. And some terms are a little bit lower than others, some terms are a little bit higher than others, and that's just depending on the general knowledge level and number of specialties a person has when they are jack of all trades, or generalist, or specialist, or polymath, that kind of thing. And so I wanted to create a spectrum so that way people can find out where they are along that spectrum. You're looking at the slideshow I made for a talk I did last year, and it was one of those things where I wanted to do that talk, and this was the topic I wanted to talk about, but it still wasn't super refined just yet, and so that's in the playlist. You can watch that, but I wanted it as kind of an intro because it just really gives a broad idea of what I'm talking about. This is the finale, so we're going to be talking about some things that you might not quite understand just yet, because we went into detail in the individual episodes. So if you are jumping into this, I would suggest going back in the playlist and looking at the original video so that we can see it in order. There is kind of a jump. The first one, multipotentialites, I recorded a while back, and then I started up the jack of all trades one after that, quite a bit years later, so my skills have gotten different. My skills have gotten better since then, but it still all flows together. And so this is the spectrum. I'm going to go through this slideshow and kind of jump off of that, but until then, here's the intro. See you on the other side. So the idea is that a lot of people who are on the spectrum, which I would presume everybody is, because I have specialists on there and dual specialties, like the spectrum is made for everybody, not just people who are multidisciplinary. And I really do think that it is our human nature to be multidisciplinary, so I do think everyone in some shape or form is, and that's why I put certain terms like T-shaped, or jack of all trades, multipotentialite, and whatever it may feel most identifiable to you. And this kind of trait among multidisciplinary people is this whole hands in all the cookie jars kind of thing, where you are literally reaching out, touching. Some people in the multipotentialite space call it like tentacles, reaching out and grabbing. If you know anything about the anatomy of an octopus, every tentacle of the octopus, I don't know why, I always do this, I don't know why I have my headphones on. An octopus has brains in each one of its tentacles, and so every tentacle that's going out, it's actually thinking about what it needs to do, and actually is part of the central nervous system of that octopus. Each of the tentacles in itself is its own appendage, but also its own brain, its own path, so to speak. And so Robert A. Heinlein was talking about how specialization is for insects. And so the idea of specialization only happens because of desperation. And I say that knowing that it's kind of a bold statement to make. But when you are specialized, you are niching down and limiting yourself to one field. And here's the deal. I don't believe that specialists are only one specialty. Most specialists that we know of, they have hobbies, they have other skills. They might have been a jack of all trades before they were a specialist. That's what David Epstein talks about in Range, where you start out kind of broad, like a jack of all trades, you find one that you really like. Maybe you like soccer if you're doing sports, or maybe you like painting instead of drawing if you're like in art. Either way, you try out all different kinds, and eventually you find one you stick with, and you become a specialist at it. And then eventually, you get bored of that, or you need to move on and find new things to challenge yourself, and you spread out again. And I would honestly believe that's more of a repetitive cycle. So you start out wide, you go narrow, you go wide, and then once again, come back to narrow and go back wide. Because we are continuous beings. We keep living, we keep progressing. We are not insects. We are not specializing just for one thing. And even if you really just want to do one thing in your life, you are still going to be doing many things throughout the course of your life. And so something I talk about in the post is that sometimes people become polymaths over the course of their life. Gradual polymaths, I think, is what they said in the link. But the idea is that by the time you're, 80 or 90, you've done like 4 different careers. You were going to be a polymath just because of age, for one. And then I do believe you can become a polymath when you're young, but it takes a lot more effort because you have to do it more expedited. So I'm going to have you raise your hand here. If you've been in this series this far, unless you skipped ahead, do you even know what a polymath is? Most people don't. In fact, I've had people who I interviewed on my show who I would consider to be polymathic, or maybe even a polymath for some of them. And the idea just kind of escapes a lot of people. Like, they just never think about it, and that's okay. But this is why I create the content, because I think people need to think about it. A polymath is someone with many knowledge areas or deep learnings, and so whenever you have 3 or 4 deep areas of knowledge or many areas of learning, that makes you a polymath, at least into a certain degree. There are some researchers out there trying to figure out like what really defines a polymath. And so I've always been very hesitant to call myself one, despite the fact other people have called me one. And I've also wanted to become one myself. And so at some points, it's probably easiest to describe myself as a polymath, considering all the areas that I do know. But there's also kind of an ego aspect behind it. If you call yourself a polymath, some people might see that as kind of an ego-driven thing, and it's not. It's more of this identifiable characteristic. That's what I try to really push people to realize, is that it's not about ego. It's about sharing who you are with the world. The multidisciplinary spectrum is a collection of terms based around the idea of specialist and generalist in society. So from the novicely jack-of-all-trades to the Da Vincian polymaths. These great distance between those two kind of terms there, like the jack-of-all-trades or like a genuine polymath, that is a lot of life and experience and skills and specialties that takes place in between there. So where do you think you fit on this spectrum? Like, there's a whole, I had a really hard time creating a chart for it, and here it is, just so you can kind of see right off the bat. Here's just a quick overview of it, just so you can kind of get an idea before I start going off on some other kind of topic there. Let's start off the extremes, right? Yeah, multi-potentialite. A lot of people might be surprised that I put it so low, but the multi-potentialite is the concept of having the potential to do many different things. Potential does not equal done many things. And so I think a lot of multi-potentialites are either confused about where they are on a spectrum, or maybe they're just starting out. I've met people who are halfway through their life who found out themselves to be multi-potentialite, and I think that's beautiful. I think that if you can think of yourself as a multidisciplinary person, you have potential to do many different things, that is great. That means you have aligned yourself with that line of thinking, and like I said, I think it's human nature to be more multidisciplinary, and so you're aligning yourself with your true nature of being human. And so I do think that it is a potential. It's not necessarily you've done many things. So a lot of multi-potentialites, you could be a multi-potentialite and still be a polymath. I don't think they're necessarily like mutually exclusive, but I think that there's a distinction to make that, hey, I know a lot more than a multi-potentialite defines myself to seem to other people. So you have the specialist, which is here in the corner. Like that's also really kind of important to note that it's one pillar. So you're all the way on the left there, not any width. And then you have omnimath. Now, omnimath is a term that you don't need to worry about, but I have it there as kind of like a limit point because a polymath really doesn't have a limit. You can have many different areas. I think Da Vinci probably capped out around 15 knowledge areas and specialties. And when I mean like specialties, like he was probably the best in the world, at least one of the best in the world in many areas: anatomy, ocular science, laser physics, wind physics, water physics. Like he discovered all of that on his own. And so that's why I have true polymath there, which is kind of I think this is a dated chart because I replaced that term just because I didn't want people thinking like, oh, if I'm a polymath, why am I not a true polymath? Because there's a difference between that. And if you look in the post that I shared with this video, there is a chart where from an article I was reading where they talked about, let me see if I can just bring that up real quick. This chart right here, there is a difference between the serial polymath and the proper polymath. And so this proper polymath is kind of the same concept of what I was talking about, the true polymath there, where they have worked in several different fields all at the same time. The difference is between the serial polymath or the ones that I mentioned earlier, where they're kind of like, or I guess the limited also kind of fits into this role too. The serial are kind of like the ones that are lifelong, like I mentioned earlier, where over time they've switched between different roles, and maybe they moved up in a company and changed career paths that way. And so those are ones that are doing it over time. They're not really juggling many different things. They just done it consecutively. The limited ones I think are really interesting, and I think I'm kind of in that middle ground where, because there has to be more definition here, because limited polymath, active in a small cluster of neighboring disciplines. Because I've been more of a juggler. I've done many different things all at once. I've been a content creator, swim instructor, fitness instructor, escape room game master, gamer, like all kinds of different heavy skills, and deep in these areas too. I've been a gamer since I was 10, so over almost 2 decades now. And so, actually probably before 10, and I've been teaching for nearly a decade too. So like there's many different deep level skills there, but I'm not necessarily a proper polymath just yet, because I'm just too young. I haven't had enough time to be 10,000 hours in many different areas, but I have done a few. And I'm just using myself as an example, because there is kind of some middle ground there where this chart of 4 different terms didn't necessarily cut it, which is why, let's go back to the other chart here. I created this one because there is the idea of a T-shaped person. I put T-shaped kind of low because I think if you are a T-shaped person, that there is kind of a opportunity cost. And that's something that a lot of people need to think about. I probably should have added a section about that in the post, because opportunity cost is something you really have to look out for. Let's take a small tangent here and talk about opportunity cost and the idea of dabbling. So a lot of the reasons why people say jack of all trades, master of none, is because in that line of thinking, especially in the specialist mindset where you're spending all your time to really become like a hyper specialist. Maybe I need to add hyper specialist in there too. The difference between polymath, true polymath, specialist, and hyper specialist. But the difference between that is the amount of time you spent on that. So the opportunity cost of being a specialist is not having the width, which is why the T-shaped person is so low, because you spent more time having width. And I would argue that a T-shaped person is more valuable than a specialist, only because they have a specialty at a deep level, but they've also had the ability to have trans-contextual thinking between many different areas. And I really wonder if I need to change the positioning of certain things here, because I don't take this as like gospel, because I literally just made it just to explain the ideas I was trying to share. I have probably even more terms I need to add to it, like scanner and linky brain, that kind of thing. But like I said, I think this is an older picture. I'll have to find a newer one, something like that. But regardless, this is just an idea that I wanted to share with you so you can see just visually what I'm talking about. I was almost thinking that I needed to make a 3D chart that might be more effective at sharing this. So in this video and in the post linked along, like most of these Omni content episodes, I always assume that people are going to watch or read one or the other. I really hope that people consume them both. That's why I include the video and podcast in the blog post itself, so that way if you find the blog post you can read it all. I include the link in the description of this video so that way you can find it. And I really hope that people go in and actually do both, because I don't necessarily create them the exact same. I use the blog post, and in this case the slides, as a basis for the video, and I expand upon different topics. That's why this video is going to be a little bit longer than some of the other ones, because it is a finale, and this blog post is one of the biggest blog posts I've ever made. And so it is going to be a massive resource for people, and that's why I wanted to make it. I'm also really excited for the SEO benefits too, because there's going to be a lot of links here. And that's one thing I want to mention too, is like when you get done with this and done with the mini series, there is a whole collection of links and videos that you can discover in the blog post and a couple different places. I have the playlist. I'll also link the playlist in the description of this video, so that way you can go find all the videos that have come along with this series. These are all the videos I was watching when creating the ideas for, not creating, but when writing down the ideas for these blog posts. And not to mention too, just some great content from a lot of great creators. Now, the multidisciplinary spectrum actually used to be known as the polymath spectrum, like I mentioned earlier, the leveling up to polymath. It's really just a curated spread of terms, and that's why I made it there. I made it curated, so that way if you come along, you're like, I identify more as a generalist rather than maybe a multipotentialite or specialist, and that's great. If you can find a term there that you can anchor onto, that anchor can drive you forward and give you more opportunity to really challenge yourself and really go into new different areas. Some people feel negative about that, and I think that's it has to do with the specialist society we lived in. And I like I said lived, but we live in, and hopefully we lived in, because like I think it is kind of going away with the internet, the whole internet renaissance of sorts, because we are really experiencing a time where being a generalist really does help people. It's a small little tangent, something that bugs the hell out of me, because if you go on certain like job applications, right, these companies are looking for unicorns or people who are specialists, like a digital marketing specialist, and you look in there, they know SEO, pay-per-click, social media marketing, TikTok, video creation, podcasting. Those are all desperate skills. They all come together. They're all kind of like that limited polymath, like in that chart earlier, but they all are interconnected. They're looking for a generalist, not a specialist, and yet they just refuse to use that word. I swear, if they just changed specialist to generalist, a general digital marketing generalist position, I swear they're going to get way more applicants, because people who are doing all those different skills, they don't look for the specialist, they look for the generalist, because they see the fact that they are doing many different things, and usually speaking, they identify like as a generalist or polymath or multi-dimensionalite anyways. I've seen that with digital marketing in particular, but that also has to do with other fields as well. This happens all the time in programming, where people know like full stack development, front and back and middle, and not to mention too, just being able to do many different frameworks and programming languages. And so in the tech world, polymaths and generalists and entrepreneurs are jack of all trades by nature. So end of the tangent there, but I really hope you enjoy this content. I created it to be inclusive. I'm finally getting to the slide after all those tangents, but I really did create it to be inclusive to everybody, because I think that specialists and generalists, they all have their role in the world, and we definitely need specialists now that like the world is getting so much more complicated. But I do think we need more bi-specialists and tri-specialists. I was talking to someone yesterday at work, and this person's going into biomedicine, and I just thought that was insane. I was like, that's awesome. Like, great, good for you. Go into that dual specialty. We need more dual specialists. And I just never even thought about biomedicine. I know that's important. One area that I think is actually underwhelmingly not enough people in it is AI medicine, where you have AI people who know AI technology and are doctors and can use that to create systems for AI to know, let's say, like what kind of like a pharmaceutical AI or perhaps a general practitioner AI, that kind of thing. So why is it so important to find a term that suits you? First off, like the slide says, curiosity. You picked up on this post or video because you were curious about what it has to say. That's great. You're indulging that curiosity. Usually people who are multi-potentialites or generalists, that kind of thing, even specialists too, we're indulging our curiosity. It is human nature to be curious, and the more you train it, because it is a skill, the more you train it, the stronger it gets. If you are a specialist, the only curiosity you are fulfilling is in that specialty. If you are a generalist, you are fulfilling that curiosity in many different areas. Personally, I had a hard time growing up because I was always trying to do many different things, and everyone tried to tell me to like focus on one thing and do that kind of thing. Luckily, I had some supportive family members about it, which is really nice. But even at a young age, I knew I wanted to be a businessman, and then eventually entrepreneur, and eventually even CEO of an international company driven to innovate technology and ideology. I got that elevator pitch down because that's what I wanted to be, and I still do, really, in a way. And in that line of thinking, it seems very simple. I make it simple so that it's easy to kind of digest, but philosophy and technology are two different areas, and not to mention too, they have a very wide range of areas too within them, subdomains, if you will. And so being multidisciplinary has been part of my life since for so long as I can remember. Even in my first job, I was doing many different roles. And so I never really followed the rules, so to speak. I decided, I want to work many different roles at once, and I got in trouble for it. Like some points they're like, hey, you're spending too many hours in this department. I need you in this department. And I'm like, well, too bad. I want to do both. And I was much more polite about it back then because I was more naive and more young, so I had to respect people more. But now that I realize like my skills are useful in many different areas, don't limit me. Let me work in all of them. I don't care about the benefits, or so to speak, just let me work more hours. And I had a hard time with that, but I realized that by following my true self, I ended up being more happy, more engaged, and actually being more beneficial to other people. And that brings me to the interviews. Because I know what it's like to really fight against that kind of social norms, I realized that I had a position where I could help others do the same, and that's exactly why I created this spectrum, and exactly why I wanted to do interviews. one thing I'm really proud of as a creator are the interviews I've done. Even though I've not been the greatest editor or getting them out on time, the interviews themselves are phenomenal. And that really has to do with the guests too. But I go out of my way to really take a holistic approach to the research. I research everything about that person I can. I'll go to their blog, their podcast, their website, their YouTube channel. And usually I don't do it like all three, but I'll usually consume the entire blog or all the podcasts they have been on or their entire YouTube channel. I'll just watch it all or read it all. It really depends, because some of those creators have like 1,000 posts and I can't really do that. But if it's like 50 to 100 posts, I'll do it. And by doing so, I find those little niche details that no one else had asked them about before. And that can really give them a full-on experience talking about hobbies, talking about heroes, talking about their jobs, talking about their interests, maybe their future interests, and really going deep into many different areas. And so the actual format of the episode is polymathic. And the real beauty of it is that a lot of people don't even realize they're polymathic. And so when they come on the show, they're like, I can't even tell you how many times I've been told, oh yeah, I didn't even know about the word polymath until you brought it to my attention. And I'm like, that's amazing. I'm glad I did. And by interviewing them, oftentimes it really shows that they are multidisciplinary, and it kind of sparks something in them. And so I could see it in their eyes. They're like, wow, that actually is true. Like, I really have been multidisciplinary in my life, and I can take advantage of that. I can really do more with my life because I realize that. And some people who've come on do know that already, and that's why I have them on. Like, they realize they're multidisciplinary, so I can ask them more advanced questions. Like, hey, how have you really managed this life then? And regardless of where they were on the spectrum, I really was excited to interview them. Like, no one on the show that I had interviewed I wasn't excited to talk to, because I knew that they all had potential, they all had multi-potential, but they all had to experience in many different areas. So it's all about leveling up to polymathy, and I really think that polymath is the goal, regardless of where you are, and whether or not you actually want to become a polymath, it doesn't really matter. Like, you don't have to be one. I'm not telling you to, like, oh, you have to be a polymath. No, I'm just saying leveling up to polymath is the goal, because the more you do, the more likely you're going to be a polymath. And so, like, regardless if you're doing it at the end of your life or in the halfway points, because you've managed to get there by the time you're 40 or 50, that's great. But Leonardo da Vinci, for example, he was an all-rounder. He was doing stuff in many different areas, contributing to science, the art, that's still irrelevant now. He created, like, sciences back then where if his research had been published, it would have advanced society tenfold, 5 times sooner, 10 times sooner, 20 times sooner. And that's the really kind of crazy thing, is that, like, because he indulged his curiosity, because he pushed himself to be a polymath, and he didn't, like, there was no word for that back then, maybe Renaissance person. But the only reason why we say Renaissance person is because of the people like him and Michelangelo who did so many different things. And really, ironically, like, they wouldn't refer themselves as that. It was more posthumously. Same with polymath. A lot of times people, when we name people polymaths, it was posthumously. But I really think that if we are dedicated and really having a strategy while still alive, we can become that. And that's one reason why there's a difference between, like, juggling many different things and context switching. And I think that depending on where you are on the spectrum, that's a skill you can learn to really upgrade yourself. And so that's kind of the idea there, where leveling up the polymath is the goal. And even if you stop at generalist or expert generalist or at try specialist, it's okay. That's great. That's who you want to be. That's completely fine. I just wanted people to realize that there are another levels, and you're not doing enough yet to get to those levels. I'm not doing enough to get to those levels. Everybody can do more. I was actually thinking about this last night. As a personal trainer and fitness instructor, my job is to tell people you're not doing enough. Gary Vee talks about creating content, and he always tells people you're not doing enough. And I think that's why a lot of people don't like him, because he's exposing an area of weakness in the people who are watching. And that's okay. That's exactly what we need. We need people like him or I or other trainers and other teachers out there to show us what we don't know. Because as the famous philosopher said, you don't know what you don't know. And so the idea of really pushing yourself beyond your limits, you do sometimes have to have that external pressure. Like, I've pushed myself plenty of times. Even last night during my workout, I pushed myself farther than I thought I could. And having that internal pressure is great. But ironically, the motivation I had in my head stemmed from my teaching background. Like, I used the same philosophy and tactics I would use on a trainee on myself. And that's how I was able to push myself through a really vigorous full body workout. And so I think that being an all-rounder and leveling up, it really does take a level of external pressure. And that's one thing I wanted to go into. So, I mean, you're going to have to go against the norm, because really, to be a generalist is going against the norm of the time, because since the Industrial Revolution, past 100 years, we've been living in a specialist world, and we're just living in it, so to speak. But the problem is, this is more of a generalist world, and we've created this social construct of specialists, and that's great. We needed that for the time, but now it's come to the time where generalists need to take back over. And I'm not fighting generalists versus specialists, because we need both. But nowadays, with the internet, we need people who are multidisciplinary to really do the jobs. Being a YouTuber is being multidisciplinary. You have to create content. You have to create product merch. You have to be able to understand AdSense and analytics and all these different skills. SEO. You really have to know SEO for YouTube and just being a content creator, like a blog, for example. And so being multidisciplinary is being on the internet, basically. Like, that's why I think a lot of people have a hard time with the computers and internet, because they have to learn so many new skills at once. Going into the ideas of the different terms, how do you know which one you are? Well, let's go into that. You have multi-potentialites, so the potential to do many different things. And I think there's going to be some people in here are going to be kind of mad that I say the multi-potentialites is so low, but it is potential. Potential isn't, like, everyone has potential. Multi-potential just means you have potential in many different areas. That's great. Follow through on those areas. Juggle it if you want. Maybe go switch between back and forth, go down a skill tree, whatever it may be, but you got to do something with that. And so I usually say that, like, multi-potentialites are kind of around the level of jack of all trades, or like almost a precursor to jack of all trades, because the jack of all trades are more of a novice level. But I do think that some multi-potentialites out there who identify as a multi are more like a generalist or jack of all trades level of knowledge, but they anchor onto multis as a term they prefer. And I was talking to Aaron Thompson, who consider himself more of an octopotentialite, kind of going after that octopus idea once again. And there's a great resource called the Octopus Movement you should check out. I'm actually going to add the link to the blog post now so I don't forget. But Perry's created that movement, and it's been phenomenal. If you find yourself aligning more towards multi-potentialites, that's a great resource for you. Next up, you have the jack of all trades. And so how do you know if you're a jack of all trades? Well, usually people will tell you that. That's one of the terms a lot of people use. I've even been told a few times myself I'm a jack of all trades. And I think that I was really excited when people said that. Now, knowing a little bit more, I kind of feel like there is a negative connotation to it, where I think the people who told me I was a jack of all trades said it in a very endearing way. But there are some times where I think even on podcasts, people have said it in a negative way to me. But the jack of all trades, master of none kind of misconception, where they're only saying half the phrase. The phrase continues, but oftentimes better than a master of one. And by being better just means that, like, hey, when you have many different trades, or all the trades in this case, but you can't really do all the trades, but when you're doing all the many trades, then you have all that diverse knowledge that can come together in unique ways. It's all about that unique cross-disciplinary knowledge. And so the belief that you are a jack of all trades basically insists that you are spreading yourself too thin. You're juggling too many things, and because of that, you can't go deep. That's not necessarily true, because we talked about the T-shaped person already, who is deep, but also jack of all trades below. But the idea, too, it is about time management. So there's a lot of time management in a lot of my posts. I even have a post called The Art of Digital Productivity, just because I think a lot of people have a hard time with understanding that you can create systems. That's why I created the personal poly-innovation operating system. Excuse me. But the idea behind that was so that I could organize every layer of extraction of my life, from the yearly down to hourly, so I can just focus on getting things done. And I'm so happy I did, because just the next 2 months, I have so much content planned out. And the idea behind Omni Content was to really create a whole bunch of foundation for all the different content I wanted to create in the future. So by creating this foundation, I could build off of it. That foundation is literally just that T-shape, right? I'm building out the foundation of my content, and then I can go into multiple different niches by doing so afterwards. And I don't even know how I came up with that idea, but I think in retrospect, it's a brilliant idea, and I want other people to steal it. But I think the idea too, that this next coming months, I kind of put the Omni content a little off to the side so I can focus more on just general content as well, so blog posts and videos on their own. But the beauty of the thing is, Omni content in general just means that you can take one piece and turn it into the other piece. So right now I'm turning my blog post and slideshow into a video, and I can do that for any blog post, even the ones that aren't Omni content, so to speak. but I don't necessarily think I'll do that just yet. But I have some great posts that are lining up that really correspond with this particular episode as well, but even some other topics I'm going to be talking about in the coming months. So I'm super excited for you all to see that. The next topic is Generalist. And so I changed the slide here because I thought measuring your skill sets is a very apt description of this. A generalist is someone who does many different things, and really I think that particular episode out of all of them is one of the ones a lot of people really need to dig into more, because generalist is a very interesting concept. It's more broad, but it's also not necessarily super deep, but it's not jack of all trades level of shallow either. And so it's kind of interesting how, like, being a generalist, I would consider myself a generalist for sure. Like polymath, I might hesitate to say just because of the whole ego connotation, but the generalist, I'm happy to say I'm a generalist because I know for a fact that because of my deep level of knowledge, but even my wide range, I could consider myself a generalist and I could anchor myself to that. And even though I wouldn't necessarily say that some of my areas are as low as a generalist may be, and like there's a lot of overlap too. I want to mention this too. Like, be sure there's a multi-potentialite, but like I said earlier, multi-potentialites could be up to a generalist level of knowledge. So maybe I need to have some kind of Venn diagram or something like that. A generalist is so broad because it could be kind of in the middle where this is kind of mild level of knowledge in all areas, or it could be some shallow with a lot of, like, it could be shallow, some experts, and you're kind of in that middle ground. It could be this way too. It's kind of weird how that all fits in together. But I digress. It's just a matter of measuring your skill sets, and I think generalist is a kind of pretty free range, like the bingo center spot where it can be applied to different terms. You can kind of be a generalist and be polymath in a way. You can be a generalist and still be a jack of all trades, kind of overlapping in many different areas. Now, this next one we need to talk about pretty well. We went back to the chart when it came to this slideshow, and I want to talk about the gentleman scholar. Now, the gentleman scholar is kind of a weird term because there's not much information on it. And I swear, when I first found out about that term, I found more articles, but I couldn't find them when I went back and researched them. But the idea of a gentleman scholar is someone with a lot of passion for learning, being an autodidact, so to speak, and really kind of being a true man, if you will. And this is kind of like a pretty old idea. It's like a few hundred years old. It's not necessarily the most ideal modern equivalent. But I wanted to bring it in there because someone with many learnings is great, but doesn't necessarily mean you've done much with it. So kind of harkening back to the multi-potentialite, where just because you have the potential to do many different things, maybe you're learning many different things, it doesn't necessarily mean you've done anything with those things. And so the real kind of disparate kind of understanding there is that because you've learned many different things, you've kind of prevented yourself from doing different things. The opportunity cost, once again, you spent so much time learning, you didn't do anything with it. That's different from multi-potentialites. A lot of multi-potentialites actually do some things. But kind of in the parentheses there, the dilettante, someone who is dabbling in many different areas. And I think that's where a lot of people mistake the jack of all trades, because the jack of all trades, master of none, they think are dilettantes. Like I say they, as in specialists, think that jack of all trades are dilettantes. They're dabbling. But jack of all trades could have a decent amount of skill. Same for the generalists too. Some people say polymaths are dabblers, but it's like, yeah, they are, but they also have many deep areas too. And so you want to avoid being just a dilettante, just dabbling. And I say that knowing fully well that you really do need to explore. As I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, we start out wide and then go narrow, then go wide. You have to dabble in order to go wide. You have to be indulging in that curiosity to go wide. But there's a certain point where you need to stop yourself and actually practice. A small little tangent, when I'm creating the modular degree framework, I was always thinking about how skill tree based learning is really interesting, where instead of having a linear module where you're going up, up, and up, you have just one pathway, right? That's where most MOOCs on like edX and Coursera are like, there's one module after one module, one after module. The idea of a skill tree is branching that out into multiple different modules. And so if you get bored of one path, you can go to another path, just like in a video game, where you are pursuing different pathways. However, the dilettante is someone who's going down different pathways because they get bored, but they won't push past it. When you're learning something new or trying to do any new skill, you're going to hit a plateau. When you hit that plateau, you can't just move on. You have to push past it. Sometimes, and this is rare, when you hit the plateau, sometimes it means you don't know enough and you have to go somewhere else. I was taking a course on edX, and I realized when I hit a plateau, I did not know enough, and I didn't have the time, because it was a timed course, I didn't have the time to learn that skill well enough, and so I had to leave and come back to it later. and that was statistics and R programming. Those are the two skills I did not know enough well, or hardly at all with R programming, in order to do the rest of the course. And so it wasn't me being a dilettante where I was kind of like only dabbling enough to that point. I had pursued it pretty well. I had pushed past some limiting breakpoints, like stuff that I didn't necessarily know very well. I had to push past that. But when I got to that point, I literally couldn't progress. And so I had to move on to something else. So there's a difference between hitting a plateau where you are blocked and a plateau where you have to really push past it. And this is kind of the personal trainer in me kind of sharing this too, because sometimes you'll hit a physical plateau where you think, oh, I can't do any more push-ups. When in actuality, if you take a 2-minute break, you go back and do a couple more. Take another 5-minute break, you can do a couple more. Take a 10-minute break, and you can do a couple more. And that's a really hard philosophy to learn for a lot of people. And I think one of the key strategies to becoming a polymath, because in order to become deep in any area of knowledge, you have to push past those breaking points. And sometimes even the roadblocks, like I mentioned earlier, there are ways of pushing past it by going down a different path and then coming back to it and pushing past it, making sure you come back to it. I'm going to go back to that course and finish it, only if to just prove myself I can do it. And so there's a difference. That's one of the differences between a polymath and like a generalist too. Sometimes a generalist or jack of all trades, they'll dabble in many different areas. They may even push themselves in some of those areas, but once they get to a really hard roadblock or plateau, they don't push them past that point. And that's where people fail at being a polymath, right? That's an area maybe I need to write more content around too, is like the failure of polymathy, where people don't push past the breaking points. So I'm already getting over the time that I really wanted a lot for this, but this is my first finale of a mini series, so I'm going to be a little bit loose on the time. So I'm going to try to wrap this up as best I can, but we're still only about like halfway through the post. So the idea next is polymath and Renaissance person. I'm going to kind of group them together because a lot of people do naturally do that. The Renaissance person is someone who knows all. And back in the day of the Italian Renaissance in particular, because there was the Arab Renaissance, there was the Islamic Renaissance, there was the Chinese Renaissance. There's a lot of different areas where they had their own Renaissance, and yet we only really talk about the Italian one. In this case, I am just going to talk about the Italian one for simplicity's sake, and that's one thing where knowing everything at that time was more palatable. Like you actually could know everything that was to know at that time, or at the very least know everything and then pursue new stuff too. That's what Da Vinci did. However, polymaths are not ones who know everything. They know many different areas at a deep level and or are very wide-ranging of learning as well. I really don't think those are ors. Like, I don't think you could really be a polymath per se if you're just learning many different areas. That's why I made it a spectrum, because if you're just learning many different areas, maybe you're more of a jack of all trades or generalist, or perhaps a dilettante, and we don't want to be that. So you could be a polymath in that case, and that's why there was those kind of skill earlier we mentioned, but just keep that in mind. The key of polymathy, though, I think, too, another key, I guess there's many keys in this episode, maybe I'll have to make an episode just about keys of polymathy. The key is drawing upon a multitude of complex bodies of knowledge. And so that way you can bring many different areas together in unique ways, that cross-disciplinary knowledge, trans-contextual thinking, really bridging together, creating a new idea from that. Next, I'm going to go over this kind of quickly. PolyInnovator, yours truly. Now, I kind of created this idea open to other people, but I realized that like now that it's become more of a personal brand, it's not necessarily, I don't want other people to be poly-innovators per se. I'm not trying to get people to be one. I will try to help innovators and perhaps maybe make innovators into poly-innovators. I don't know necessarily what that would be, but the idea was that I wanted to be someone who was innovating many different areas in my life. That was the whole concept behind that elevator pitch earlier. And so PolyInnovator came about this idea of a polymath of innovation. So this particular episode, I think I might have failed at sharing one big thing, and that's the niched polymath. And so this goes back to that chart we mentioned earlier of just the polymath levels, and that's the limited polymath, someone with a wide range, but all in that same cluster of knowledge. And I think that's where the future of polymathy really lies too. Like, sure, we'll have genuine polymaths and regular polymaths and people who are jack of all trades. That's great. I want to have as many as we can. But I think where a lot of people are going to really shine is finding that niched polymath, right? And it's so counterintuitive to think about, like, hey, polymath is many different areas. I hate it when people tell me to niche down, niche down, niche down. But if you look at some people out there, their range of knowledge is all clustered in science. Their range of knowledge is all clustered in math or art, like the creative polymaths, as Michael Rocky kind of goes into. They're all about like more art and creating and being creative. And so that is a niche, so to speak. And so I think there is kind of this place where my niche is just being innovative in many different areas. but that's not necessarily a niche. It's kind of more of just a goal. So it's kind of a weird, kind of fun tidbit there, but I think that's kind of where I sit PolyInnovator in there. Next is a universalist polymath, or what I would call a true polymath or genuine polymath, whatever proper polymath, whatever term you want to use. I felt that universalist was a little bit more aptly described, because the universalist polymath is just someone who has many deep areas, but also a wide range as well. And sometimes that wide range is more of a generalist level of knowledge. It's kind of beautiful because they've somehow managed to be an expert in many different areas, but also having a deeper level of knowledge, more than a jack of all trades or even a lot of generalists in many different areas. And so that's a very interesting dynamic where not only are they a multi-specialist, but they're also a multi-generalist too. And so these slides you can actually find in the blog post as well, right after the spot where all the terms are listed, and that way you can kind of look through it yourself if I go too fast. And so the idea too, let's kind of go through, they are the key to the future. I don't really think there's much else here to really share, but the idea behind the polymath spectrum, or the multidisciplinary spectrum in this case, was to be able to find your own spot. I wanted you to be able to figure out where you are in that spectrum so you can really anchor yourself to that. And so this is where I'm going to wrap up, and I think the real idea key here is that when you are finding yourself on this chart and trying to find where that anchor could be, try to think about what areas of knowledge you've known. Like, how deep are you in certain areas? Like for me, I'm a swimming expert. I never did swimming competitively, so that's an area that I could really do more knowledge deep. That's an area where I could learn more about, but I have learned how to teach, how to swim really well, and the physics and the philosophy of it, I know it deeply. Same with omnichannel content marketing. If you want to be everywhere, I know how to do that, especially if you add e-commerce to it. But I think even if you're just multi-channel, you can go for that omnichannel approach. Now, finally, I'm getting to the end here, and I want you to just realize that there's a lot of links here, a lot of resources. Please, 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 at least a couple. Go in there and just watch a couple of videos, read a couple articles. There's so many great pieces in here that I just can't help but share it. And so if you go to the bottom of this page, all the links from all the posts before are in this page. So if you looked at each episode, you'll find the same links are here. I didn't want to make people go to the older episodes just to see the links from those episodes. So like if I was doing research for the Renaissance Person episode, those posts were in there. I just basically consolidated them all into this post so that way you could just see them all at once. There wasn't really much of an order to it. I tried to, but it was too much to really kind of organize. However, I did organize the videos as best I could. So there is a playlist, a couple different points in the video, a couple different points in the blog post is listed, as well as the description of the video here. Go check out that playlist, watch the other videos in the series, and also watch the episodes. Also watch the videos that I shared in the playlist, because there's some amazing content there from Tim Ferriss, Dr. Angela Catalesa, as well as even like the Pioneer. So I think there's a lot of great content for people to look at. And I really tried to be a curator of all the polymath content online, whether it is from generalists to jack of all trades, polymaths, specialists, like whatever I could find, I put in there. All right, thank you all. Make sure you go check out the blog post if you haven't, or listen to the podcast, or watch a video, whatever you're coming in on. Go check out the other piece of content just to see what it's like. All right, cheers.